I want to start by saying that it's quite obvious that over the last few days the whole atmosphere in the camp has been completely dominated by election fever. Very difficult not to get the feeling that people aren't very anxious to get home to the cut and thrust of debate between Margaret Callaghan and James Thatcher, which you can see here really any time on the television. People are very anxious, having missed the television here, to get back to that. You go around the camp at night and you hear people shouting out the names of their Labour candidates in desperation, longing to get back to the fray, and that this has been a bit of a waste of time, really, to talk about a lot of things which haven't to do with the very, very important thing which is electrifying the country at the moment. The battle of the Titans, it was described in the Sunday Mirror the other day. The Titans, of course, were the gods. The most exciting election since 1945, another one said, and that gives you a fairly dreadful picture of just how exciting it was in 1945. And I had a feeling that there was going to be an election campaign on during this year's rally, and therefore wanted to talk about the Paris Commune. Really to give people the idea that, just in case they felt that this was really all that democracy was about, the kind of thing that we're going through now, this idiotic campaigning and posturing and so on, which doesn't seem to have any connection with people's lives, that there is another form of democracy, and a stronger and fresher and richer form of democracy, which first saw the light of day, first experienced by human beings in the Paris Commune 108 years ago. And that's really why I wanted to introduce that to you, really. That was the purpose of speaking on this subject here today. I have to take you back 108 years to almost to the day, 108 years. March the 18th, 1871, one of the great dates in all our history, in the city of Paris. I don't know how many people here have been to Paris. I never have, but I understand that the heights of Montmartre overlook the parts of the city which are most normally densely occupied by working class people, which is the East End of Paris, as it is, funnily enough, in the East End of many other cities that may be better known to us. And it was, the story starts really on the heights of Montmartre, where there is a great square or park at the top of the hill, and starts about 3 o'clock in the morning, when the whole of that square is completely dominated by cannon. There were 250 cannon standing cheek by jowl in that small space. That was perhaps the biggest collection of artillery you'd find anywhere in the whole world at that time. What were the guns doing there? The guns were there because they'd just been used in a war between France and Germany, in which Paris had been besieged for the whole of the winter, one of the most famous sieges in history, in which people ended up almost eating themselves, certainly eating anything that they could get hold of. And the war with Russia, the war with Prussia ended in what most Parisians regarded as a total sellout. It seemed to them that there was no point in fighting through that war and that siege for the armistice that the government eventually signed. But immediately after the armistice, elections were called throughout France, a general election which returned a government which, if it had included Margaret Thatcher, she would have been regarded as rather a left-wing revolutionary in it. It was composed entirely of people who'd been elected, well, not entirely, but in the main, from the great rural majority of France, which at that time, and to some extent at this, was dominated almost entirely by superstition, and which was able to be bent in the most obvious right-wing direction at any given time. And it was headed by a man called Adolphe Thiers, who was described by Marx, and I'm sure you all realize that Marx was a very objective observer and somebody who never gave himself up to passion of any kind whatever, very accurately, as a monstrous gnome. He was He was a typical bourgeois politician, deceitful, corrupt, couldn't believe a word he said. He was for war when the war party was winning and for peace when the peace party were winning, and he was on any side that he reckoned was going to win, and he was put at the head of this new government. And his immediate problem was Paris, because the situation in Paris was completely different to all the politics which were represented by that new government and that new assembly that had been elected chiefly in the country. Because the workers of Paris, and most of the people in Paris were workers, and many of them, 70,000 in fact, had been affiliated to the International Working Men's Association, which was started by Karl Marx and others only 7 years previously. The workers of Paris were angry at the new government, angry at the legislation which the new government was threatening, particularly to reintroduce the rents which had been suspended for the period of the siege, which they said had to be back-paid all the way back to October. They were angry at the sellout to Prussia, which they regarded the armistice. They were angry at their working conditions, which were lower than they had been for a very long time. They were boiling, and because they were boiling, Thiers realized that there was a revolutionary tradition in Paris which had to be cut short. And in particular, he was worried about one thing. He was worried about the cannon on the heights of Montmartre, because the cannon had got to the heights of Montmartre by a very simple process. The people had taken them there. They weren't based there. They were based in camps and artillery depots which were looked over by decent officers, the type of which Thiers could trust. But on February the 26th, only, 3 weeks before March the 18th, practically the entire working class population of Paris, men, women and children, had streamed out of their houses, down into these great depots, seized hold of the cannon. I don't know how many people here have in their experience tried to move a cannon. It is quite a difficult process, sort of thing you might do Sunday night out at Blenheim or something of that kind. Very difficult thing to do, to move a cannon, but they moved them. They moved about 400 pieces, 250 of them went to Montmartre, and they moved them right across the city because there were so many of them, the women and the children leading the operation. Who was it who had given the command for this fantastic operation to take place? Who'd given the orders? The orders had been given by a body called the Central Committee of the National Guard. Now, the National Guard was the force which had been set up in Paris, really of volunteers, of all the workers of Paris, really, to fight against the Prussians during the siege. Everybody had been engaged in it. And of course it was controlled, as bodies like that are when they start off, in the ordinary way, by officers being appointed by generals, and generals being appointed by generals, and then generals going on being appointed by generals, and then appointing the officers, and the whole democracy working in that normal way in which armies, generally speaking, are controlled. But after a little bit of the war, in fact, well on into the siege, the movement for democracy inside the National Guard threw off its officers, refused to obey the orders of those appointed officers, and started instead to elect their own. And by the time we're coming now to February the 26th, when the order was given to take the cannon, the Central Committee is composed of delegates from each of the 19 companies of the National Guard, each electing a delegate regardless of rank. And because, of course, most of the people in the National Guard were workers, each of the 19 members of the Central Committee of the National Guard were working people, people who relied on the miserable wages which workers were getting there, cobblers, artisans, all different kinds of workers that were operating in Paris at that time. That was the Central Committee of the National Guard, which was a genuine democracy, and which was a much more genuine democracy than anything else that existed in France at that time. And therefore, in the period up to March the 18th, what you get is what you get in time and time again in all these times that we talk about the great revolutions of our tradition. You have a condition of what is called dual power. On the one hand, the power of the government, normally expecting obedience, the power of the civil service and the judges and the police and the armed forces around the government, expecting obedience from the people that they're handing out the orders to. But on the other hand, a new body, the Central Committee of the National Guard, the minutes of their meetings published, discussed, no one on the Central Committee receiving any more than the people that they represented, plenary meetings held in all the companies every week to discuss the decisions of the Central Committee of the National Guard, rising up not just as a body connected with the National Guard, but a body then that could start to do the things that people wanted doing to their homes, to their workplaces, to their streets, whatever the problems arose. So people started to turn to their delegate from the National Guard because he was somebody that they knew. And therefore, because he was somebody that they knew, they thought that they could get the job done better, and by and large it started to do better. And on the 26th of February, they said that they had to get the guns, because if they didn't get the guns, the new reactionary government of France might get the guns, and they had to get the guns where they could confidently be guarded in the working class districts. And so it is that the guns were there early that morning on March the 18th. And if you were able to watch it as though it was some kind of a scene in the play, there were the guns early in the morning, and suddenly the whole square, the whole concourse there is full of soldiers. Not National Guard soldiers, but the soldiers of Thiers, the soldiers of the new French government, who had come on the orders of the government to seize the guns back and place them in parts of the city or parts outside the city where the government could use them more effectively. That was the operation, brilliantly carried out. I mean, there were 5-star generals in charge of this operation, and if you want to occupy 250 cannon with about 1,000 men, then that's a difficult logistic business, and they put to some end, and they managed to do it. You know, it took them about half an hour, and they were all standing by the cannon and occupying them. As there were only 2 people guarding 250 cannon, it wasn't a particularly difficult operation, and indeed they did manage, in the course of the thing, actually to shoot one of the people that was guarding them in the arm, and his name was Turpin, and he fell down wounded. So there they were, occupying the cannon. But you see, there were 5-star generals in charge of the operation, and because there were 5-star generals in charge of the operation, they had forgotten a rather simple matter. And that is that in order to move cannon quickly without a lot of people, you need horses. And somebody had forgotten to order the horses. And a very embarrassing period followed, in which a lot of people in full dress uniform were standing at attention, because you always stand at attention. You have in that kind of the unity of the barrack room, whereas the Central Committee claimed that they had the unity of the hive, 2 different kinds. But the unity of the barrack room was standing up, every soldier very, very straight beside his cannon, and wondering what the hell was going to happen, because the sun was coming up and people were coming out of their houses. The people who had brought the cannon from the other side of the town to that part so that it could be properly guarded. Rather surprised to see a lot of soldiers standing rather sheepishly around their guns, saying, "What are you doing? We're waiting for the horses. What are the horses going to do? I'm going to take the cannon away." "Oh, no, they're not. We brought them here the other day. What do you want to take them over?" Discussions like this started to come up. People were being late for work, you know, sort of all sorts of different arguments developing along those lines. And very early in this process, if you imagine one of the roads that runs up to the Montmartre, and imagine the picture, few people straddled around the square having these discussions and these arguments, the generals anxiously ordering the people not to talk to the people that were talking to them, and running up the road that leads on one side to Montmartre, there came a woman running. In fact, this woman, as far as one could discover in the whole course of this story, is always running. And her name was Louise Michel. She was, and I throw this out just as a purely subsidiary fact, particularly for the benefit of those people, youth fetishists, who are around the place, who think that people are finished by the age that they're 25. She was, and I repeat, it's entirely a coincidence, 41 years old. She was a member of the Vigilance Committee, which had been set up to look after the guns and other matters in Montmartre. well, very, very few women members of vigilance committees at that time, and she was running up with a message for one of the people who had been guarding the guns. And as she came to the top of the hill, she found the man that she wanted to give the message to, who was Turpin, who was lying on the ground wounded where he'd been shot in the course of this brilliant occupation which the soldiers had made of the cannon. And she started immediately to tend him, to tend his wounds. And as she did so, she noticed out of the corner of her eye the mayor of Montmartre, who was a very important person indeed. He was rather like that bloke who got elected the other day for the Liberal Party for Edge Hill. Do you remember? A man called David Alton. Tremendously aggressive, overconfident, arrogant accountants who think they have the problems of the working class at heart. He was 29, and he came... And he came to speak to the general who was in charge of the guns. And he says to the general in charge of the guns, "I am the mayor of Montmartre." Terribly important person, you know, he just won the by-election at Edge Hill. And I demand that this troop, these soldiers, leave this territory because I'm in charge of Montmartre, and anyway I'm negotiating to try and get this cannon out of here by peaceful means. You know, the middle road, you know. He didn't want the guns anywhere. We said, well, there weren't any guns in the world, and then there would be more liberal councillors and mayors, mayors of Montmartre. Louise Michel was listening to this conversation, and she heard the general say this. In fact, I think probably what he said to him were two words which can't possibly be repeated in a family rally of this nature. But what he's alleged to have said, published to the mayor, was to get back to his mayor's parlour, and that he, General Lecomte, was in charge of Montmartre at the time, just as in the whole French army was in charge of Paris, and the filthy, disgusting rabble that had taken these guns out of the place where they should have been were going to get taught a lesson. That was what the mayor of Montmartre was. Of course, he went off. He went straight back to his mayor's parlour. He fades out of the story. You can forget about him, just as in a few months you'll be forgetting about the Liberal MP for Edge Hill. Louise Michel understood what was said extremely well. Who was this woman? And where had she come from? She was not a Parisian. She was born outside Paris. She was born born in one of the great castles, bourgeois castles of Paris that anybody who's ever been to the French countryside can't help noticing. She was born in a castle, but she was the daughter of the serving maid in the castle. No one ever knows who her father was. Her father was probably the son of the man who ran the castle. That's just a guess, because on judging from the normal morality of the Catholic rural bourgeoisie of France, their normal morality was that instead of explaining about the facts of life to your male children, you handed over to them one of the more attractive female servants for them to experiment with. It only gives me a little bit of pleasure to think that the particularly young barbarian that happened to take advantage of that particular maid in that particular castle at that particular time, if only he'd known what the result of what he was doing meant to his class for the next 30 years, he wouldn't have had anything to do with it. However, that is where how Louise Michel was born. She was looked after in quite a kindly way by the grandfather, the father of the man who was probably the father of her child, the old man who ran the castle, who taught her to read and to write. And by the time she was 15, she was reading and writing in the way that other people eat and sleep, with tremendous veracity and eagerness. And she was kicked out of the castle as soon as the old man died, and she took a teacher's diploma, became a teacher, which was about the only thing that an educated woman at that time in France could become, or a literate woman, I should say, in France could become. And she was, in the course of about 3 or 4 years, thrown out of about 5 teaching establishments all around the provincial territory because she insisted on teaching children the way she wanted them to be taught, and not the way she was told to teach them. And she was drawn inexorably, as people were in France at that time, really anybody with a thought in their head, anyone with a breath of independence, let alone a radical or a revolutionary, were drawn automatically to Paris, because the two worlds were entirely different. The provincial structured world the superstitious world of the provinces, and this Paris with all its radical and revolutionary tradition and its great seething mass of discussions and arguments that took place in the Republican areas and particularly in the working class areas. She was drawn to that, and she became very active in the radical and Republican revolutionary circles. She very quickly became a revolutionary. She very quickly detected that it was the central aspect of society was class. She sided with the working class against the bourgeoisie. She became a prominent speaker, but she found that although she found that the atmosphere of the clubs and the discussions which took place in Paris in the 1850s and particularly in the late 1860s very welcome and very exciting, she discovered that they didn't find her particularly welcome or exciting for the simple reason that she was a woman. And there was in France then, perhaps even more than there is in Britain today, along on the left, a tremendous suspicion and hostility of any woman who had any independent ideas of any kind. I think one of the reasons for that, or perhaps an example of that, is the writings of a philosopher who I hope that none of you have heard, called Proudhon, who was a man who really was very interested in all different kinds of weird fantasies, whipping up people's imaginations, tremendously highly read among revolutionaries in France at that time, precisely because he didn't have any precise plan for changing the world, but really dallied in phraseology of one kind or another, much more interested in the great oratorical flowery phrases than he was in the reality. And he was a male chauvinist to beat all male chauvinists. Here is his published advice to young men. If you want to get married, understand at the outset that the prime requisite for a man is to dominate his wife and to be the master. A woman is either a housewife or a whore. He managed to, Proudhon, I hope I'm putting you off Proudhon, I very much hope that as a result of this nobody will ever read any Proudhon again. That's one of the... He managed to combine, as these people so often do, a certain sort of pornography with a Puritanism. You know, he was a kind of Mary Whitehouse grinning at page 3 of the Sun. You know, that idea, the combination, which is so much just one side, two sides of the same coin. And Louise Michel, Proudhon was exceedingly popular. Indeed, he was perhaps the dominant thinker, or the dominant... people read more of Proudhon and were more influenced by Proudhon on the left in France at that time, perhaps, than anyone else. And this particular theme, of course, popularized his views even more. And Louise Michel, as she went into those clubs, particularly after the free speech, there was some kind of free speech measures in 1868, found it extremely difficult to proceed. She had to put up with all the silly sniggering and the banter which greeted any intervention by any woman, and nevertheless she managed to establish some kind of credibility in those clubs and in the movement. She joined the International Working Men's Association, which was very, very difficult for a woman to do, particularly as it was called the International Working Men's Association, but she managed to join it. I don't know quite how. She also managed to join the National Guard, which was pretty remarkable, because the National Guard was entirely composed of men, and indeed, when she was running up that hill in Montmartre on the 18th of March, she was wearing the uniform of the National Guard, and she was probably one of the only women who would have been accepted in that uniform in that area because of her reputation at that time. At any rate, she heard the discussion with the mayor, and she heard what the mayor had to say, the general had to say to the mayor, and as she heard it, she rose up from Turpin and turned down the hill, shouting and yelling and banging on the doors that treachery was afoot, that their place was being taken over by the army, that their guns were being taken back to the artillery parks, that they had to come out, that they had whatever, didn't mean whether they had any weapons, didn't want any weapons, they had to come out of there, and they had to stop this thing happening. She went and ordered all the church bells to be ringing. About 10 minutes, the
wretched soldiers on Montmartre. There weren't any horses. It was now about 8 o'clock in the morning. There were lots of people in the square. The church bells were making a terrific din. They were being pushed back to the square, the army, trying to separate them off. Don't talk to anyone. Talking's dangerous. It's democratic. It's subversive. Whatever you do, don't say anything to anyone. Being pushed back, the generals desperately trying to keep control, being pushed off the cannon to the end, and suddenly they look behind them, and on the other side of the Montmartre hill, you see another crowd of people coming up, led this time by Louise Michel. She'd already collected about 200 women behind her, all of them women, most of them with rifles, charging up the hill, charging into what was perhaps 3,000 armed men who could turn round and shoot them to pieces. We ran up, this is from her memoirs, we ran up at the double, knowing that at the top there was an army in battle formation. We expected to die for liberty. It was as if we were lifted from the earth. La Butte, that's the other side of the Montmartre, was enveloped in white light, a splendid dawn of deliverance. Suddenly I saw my mother beside me. I felt an anguish, worried for us she'd come to help us. All womankind was at our side. I don't know how. And Leconte, the general, turning and seeing this astonishing sight, reacted in the chivalrous way in which all generals have reacted in such circumstances throughout the centuries. You know, women were women as long as they were in the home, but when they were charging up at the hill at you with rifles in your hand, you give the order to fire. And 3 times he gave the order to fire. There was no question of any fire coming from the women. They were running up the hill. But 3 times he gave the order to fire, and each time the women stopped expecting the fire. But on each occasion, as on the other side, the infiltration of people. What do you mean fire? What do you mean? What's all this about fire? He wants you to fire. Well, you can't go and fire on a lot of women and so on. And if that general looked round, he sees the whole place is infiltrated by people who are saying to him, look, you can't possibly fire on these women. That's absolutely ridiculous. And suddenly, a sergeant, which proves the fact anyone been in the army, not all sergeants are bastards, suddenly a sergeant shouts out, we'll have to mutiny. It's no good. We'll have to put up our weapons. And instead of the volley of fire which Leconte had expected, what happened was that the butts of the rifles were turned up, and of course, as soon as that happened, in a flash, an enormous crowd had descended upon the soldiers. There was a tremendous fraternization, a tremendous cheerfulness, bottles of wine, which people hadn't believed existed after all those years of siege, suddenly started to appear. There was a tremendous, right across the whole area, if you can imagine it. I wish there were photographs then. There weren't, unfortunately, but if there was a photograph of that scene of perhaps 1,000 troops, 2,000 troops and perhaps 3,000 people, plus all these women with their rifles, all around the place, talking and slapping each other on the back, and pulling the generals off their horse and taking them away for trial. If you can imagine that scene, it really is one of the glorious scenes of our history, because, of course, when the news was taken to Adolphe Thiers, down in his house in another part of Paris, he was not at all happy, and he responded as members of his class. He fled at once, within about 20 minutes of hearing, and whether managed to pack the silver. In fact, they didn't pack the silver. The silver was there when he got back there, unfortunately. That's the least they could have done, was to take the silver. However, he didn't even pack the silver. He was off. He took with him the entire machinery of the government administration. It was as though Whitehall was suddenly completely deserted, that all the people out of all the ministries, all the generals, all the police chiefs, all the people in charge of all the society, of all the government and all the society, including the Paris municipality, left and set up government in Versailles, which is 40 miles down the road, something of that kind. They set up government there in the Versailles, and they became then the French government of Versailles. And from the moment that he left, of course, Thiers swore that there would be revenge for what had been done there, and he would come back, and next time he came back, he would come back in blood. But at any rate, on the evening of March the 18th, the Central Committee of the National Guard entered and occupied the Hôtel de Ville, which had been the seat of government in France for countless generations. And there they sat down and became the government, effectively, the government of Paris. No other government remained. Hundreds of rich people, wonderful sight, wonderful
It's a wonderful thought to think of hundreds of rich people, striped pants and the like, rushing out, sort of sneaking out of the back door, rushing, walking, anywhere, leaving the city by every conceivable way. It's rather like a kind of what happens, I think, with rat infectant, when you start to, rodent poisoning, you start to put it in, and they were all rushing out of the city, and the Central Committee of the National Guard were in complete control. And immediately there was an argument. An intense argument inside the Central Committee. And the argument was like this. 3-4 members of the Central Committee say, we have to march upon Versailles. Now we have to march upon them. The army is demoralized by all this fraternizing. There's only about 20,000 of them. There's at least 60,000 armed men in Paris, which make a much better army than they've got. If we go to Versailles, and this is the greatest argument of all, if we go now to Versailles, we will be able, by our actions, by smashing the government there, to raise the workers in all the other French cities, Lyon, Marseille, Narbonne, all the other great cities of France, and make communes, great municipalities there, which will then much more effectively challenge the government of France than simply the Paris municipality. They argued passionately for it. Louise Michel, who of course was not a member of the National Committee of the Central Committee of the National Guard, because no women theoretically were members of such a body and therefore obviously couldn't be on the Central Committee, but grabbed, outside the Hotel de Ville, grabbing the people that she knew on the Central Committee and insisting, we have now to march upon Versailles. Now is the time. The moment a revolutionary movement goes upon the defensive, it's finished. And now's the time that we can put the knife in and start to establish something really which will quite possibly change the world. But the majority on the Central Committee, just as over and over and over again in our own experiences, working people in conditions which they're unused to, where they're having to take decisions, opt all the time for the decent alternative, the legal alternative. They wanted to do things the proper way, according to legality. And therefore they said that what they weren't properly constituted, you can imagine anybody taking power ever saying that. They weren't a properly constituted body. They weren't properly elected. All they were interested in doing was handing over to an elected body, an elected Paris municipality, which would then be able to govern properly. That was the decision of the Central Committee, and they went ahead. I think by the decision it's obvious that a tremendous amount of ground was lost for the Commune and for the social revolution which the Commune was beginning to usher in. But nevertheless, that was the decision. And they went about their business of calling an election. And the election was called in Paris 8 days after the guns had been seized on the 18th of March. On the 26th of March, elections were held. And on the 24th, the Central Committee of the National Guard issued a proclamation. And I believe that this proclamation ought to be like a warning on cigarette packets for all election processes that take place anywhere in the world. It ought to be mandatory after every television program upon the television that we have to watch over the next few weeks. This is what they advised people. Just imagine it. Do not lose sight of the fact that the men who will serve you best are those whom you choose from among yourselves, living your life, suffering your ills. Distrust the ambitious, no less than the upstart. Both consult only their own interests and always end by finding themselves indispensable. Distrust also talkers, incapable of translating words into action. They sacrifice everything to a speech, an oratorical effect, an empty phrase. Avoid, too, those whom fortune has too highly favored, for only too rarely is he who possesses fortune disposed to look upon the working man as his brother. In short, seek men of sincere conviction, men of the people, resolute and active, men of sense and recognized honesty. Give your preference to those who do not ostentatiously solicit your votes. True merit is modest, and it is for the voters to recognize their men. That would be wonderful after a Callahan parliamentary... Give your preference to those who do not ostentatiously solicit your votes. True merit is modest. At any rate, not surprisingly, these elections
were greeted with tremendous enthusiasm. 220,000 people out of 400,000 on the register voted. And of course, a lot of people had left Paris. A lot of the rich had left. So it's probable that about 60 to 70% of the people that voted. And by voting, really, you were accepting that the Commune should be voted for. I mean, obviously, you wouldn't vote if you thought there should be no such assembly set up in opposition to the government. And all the people elected, by and large, all of them, were people who represented what one bourgeois writer of the time called the Red Republicans. By and large, they were all Reds or Republicans. 24 of them were members of the Socialist International, the Working Men's International, but declared socialists, people who saw things in a socialist light. Many of the others were Proudhonites, Blanquists, people who were revolutionary, at least in word, if not perhaps in deed. But at any rate, we'll come to that in a minute. But at any rate, they were people who represented the working people and represented a change in the class structure of society. And this is the most important thing of all, which is contained really in a book which I handle with tremendous reverence. If you want to read about the Paris Commune, want to read the best book still, and it was written one day after the Commune fell. It was written on May the 29th, 1871, and given as an address to the International Working Men's Association by Karl Marx on May the 30th, 1871, The Civil War in France, a book which is really a magnificent piece of political journalism. I mean, people who think that Marx is a boring writer, stuttering around the British Museum with a lot of figures writing about commodities, chapter 1, commodities. I mean, it is a bit grim by the time you've got to page 92. I quite agree, it's a bit grim. But if you want to read political journalism describing the sort of things that were going on in the Paris Commune, the Civil War in France, and what is the central point of this? That the result of the elections that took place in Paris on March the 26th, 1871, were quite different to the result of any other elections which had ever taken place any other time in the world, and if you want to take it further, almost, with few exceptions of Russia in 1917 and the like, different to any elections that have taken place since. And different in this crucial respect, that the machinery for carrying out the decisions of the decision makers was also transformed in the process of the election. That always seemed to me, before I read that book, as the stumbling block. You voted for decision makers. That seemed to be good enough. And the only alternative put up by people who call themselves socialists appeared to be a system where nobody voted for anything at all. That was what people proposed, and that was what you had to choose between, a parliamentary system or a system where nobody votes for anything at all. Here now what they're talking about is a voting system which means something because the votes go through the decision makers into the business of carrying them out. That when a law is passed about the police, instead of saying to the police, you carry out that law, you supervise the law of theft or mugging or whatever it may be, the police themselves were responsive to the same kind of democracy that operated in the Commune. And just as that went for the police, it went for the army, it went for every section of the civil service and the bureaucracy, themselves rooted the decision-making process, itself democratic, just as the decision-makers were elected. They weren't just workers in government. I mean, we can imagine that today, can't we? Workers in government. Roy Mason, I cite as an example. 300 years ago, he was a miner. And he can say, I was a worker. And you can point to people in the Labour cabinet and say, these are workers. And workers in government, all right, we've seen them after 70 years of social democracy. We've seen sometimes, not so many now, but in the old days of the Labour Party, you could see a lot of working people there in Parliament. But workers carrying out the decisions of government, when did we see that? When did we see workers at the head of police forces, head of worker judges, worker magistrates, worker newspaper proprietors, all these, where did we see these people as workers? We haven't seen them at all. And that was what the Paris Commune, the results of the Paris Commune election, that was the thing that was different to anything else. And if you look and see the achievements of the Commune, remembering that it lasted for, 2 months? 2 months it was allowed to last. 2 months in most of which it was under constant harassment and siege from the Versailles army. And when you look and see what it is that they did in that time, I mean, 2 months, I understand. I've rung up a few people and I understand that it is roughly the time that it takes between a bill in Parliament goes between the first reading and the second reading. Do you know, that's roughly what 2 months is. First reading, any objections? Oh dear, there are a few. Well, in that case, we'll come back to it in 2 months' time. Then we'll have a second reading, and then we'll have a third reading, and then it'll go to the House of Lords, and then it'll be mangled by the civil service and mashed up by the parliamentary clerks, and then it'll become law, and it'll be reversed by the judges. That's roughly the system of parliamentary democracy which exists at the moment. The period in which it takes between the first reading and the second reading is 2 months, and this is the sort of thing that happened in the Commune. Right away, the government decision that rents should have to be paid way back to October was revoked, and all that period of back rent was immediately just written off. That evictions were banned by decree on the second day of the Commune, all evictions. That the pawn shops, I mean, these things may not seem terribly important to this extremely wealthy assembly that I'm talking to now, but in the Paris of 1871, the pawn shop was a central part of the establishment. The pawn shop held the hand round the throat of most of the working people in that area, and pawn shops were ordered by the government to hand back all the goods that they'd had from the workers over the period of the last 9 months, and the government would compensate the pawn shops for that operation, and so therefore all that went back there. The Commission of Labour, which was run almost entirely by members of the International, abolished, for instance, night work in the bakeries, central to a whole lot of the exploitation that took place at the time. Took over all the empty workshops in the territories and started plans to form cooperative workers' enterprises which could run them properly. Started a process of accident insurance for workers which had never existed in France before. Education by decree, and it was carried out in a single blow, was secularized. Education in Paris, which had been almost entirely dominated by religion and superstition and all kinds of horrible fantasies, was secularized, taken out of the hands of the nuns and the monks and put into the hands of people who were instructed in a wonderful decree that went out, a letter that went out from the Commune about education, to concentrate upon the facts of the society around them rather than the fantasies, and to apply themselves most of all to putting right, and this is the quote, the greatest malady of children, boredom. Schools were bad because they were boring. That's what was wrong with school. And we say, what's wrong with school? It's boring. It's boring for the children, it's boring for the teacher, and boring teachers get more boring and worse, and everybody gets more bored, and everybody's so bored. And they said, that's the thing you have to apply your mind to above all, is the question of dealing with the bored. Absolutely monstrous. At a time when people want to learn most, are free from all the pressures that exist upon adults, and can learn most, that they become the most bored elements of people in the society, the young people at school. Law and order. I'm just going through the Tory manifesto now, really, to see whether the Paris Commune did pretty good job, you know. Even the people at the time talking now about even the bourgeois walking around saying it was strange they weren't mugged. No muggers. Suddenly, for no reason at all. There was the lowest rate of robbery in any 2 months, in any period from the whole of 1850 to 1900. Happened to be the 2 months in which the Paris Commune was operating there. And everybody referred to that. There was an enormous quantity of newspapers bursting out, all kinds of sectarian newspapers. Everybody got their point to say. The best newspapers were the ones that weren't sectarian newspapers. The best newspapers were papers like Valaise's Cri de Peuple, which applied its mind to interesting people and amusing people and thus exciting them to the ideas of the revolution, very much more successful than the smaller circulation sectarian papers, a point which, of course, has absolutely no relevance whatever to anything that might apply might apply today. I picked up this book. I don't know which particular branch I was speaking to when I went into this. Whoever it is deserves a medal. I'll go again, because I picked up this book, Paris during the Commune, 1871, the Reverend William Gibson, B.A., on the front. B.A., he's a very important person, happened to be stuck in Paris, couldn't get his flight home, desperate, wet his pants 50 times, then couldn't find the laundry, because he couldn't get out of Paris in time, and therefore he was stuck in Paris, and after about the fourth day of shutting himself up with blinds, and fearing of huge red revolutionaries, all of them homosexual, coming into the room to do something terrible, he actually went out and started to look around, and he says, turning the corner of the Rue Royale, I don't know what he was expecting to see there, some frightful obscenity. I saw that the beautiful fountains in the Place de la Concorde were in full play in honor of the new regime. All along, I observed that the wants of the city were being well and carefully attended to. Whether it is that the new broom sweeps clean, that's a joke, that's a joke. Good one for the pulpit there, I know not, but certain it is that I have never seen the streets of Paris so well swept since the siege as they were this morning. The heaps of rubbish are being cleared away. Fantastic what these revolutionaries can do. The center of the road as well as the causeways well swept, and the men were busy watering the roads, a sight very grateful to me, for during the last windy days I've been almost choked with dust. Now, this man, that's just a passage from a book which, of course, is absolutely terrible about the people who were absolute monsters. Oh, horrible, red Republicans of the most extravagant kind. And when he actually went out and had a look around him, he goes on to say that he went to the palace, expecting to find the whole place in flames, of course, the Tuileries. He went out to Buckingham Palace, that's the symbol of everything. He found the whole place. He could actually walk into it. He was absolutely delighted. He'd never been in there before because he'd been shut off, but he was allowed to go in after the Commune. These are all things that you could go on. The cultural atmosphere of the place was absolutely fantastic. All the churches were taken over. They were taken over for debates, places which had echoed throughout the centuries to dreary psalms and hymns were now the places of fantastic debates. Women took over 3 or 4 of these churches and held debate after debate on the women's question, went on in the churches, packed to the doors every night, often all through the day. These arguments and debates continued. The palace itself, most of it was taken over. There was no damage done to any of the palace, but it was taken over, and the big rooms, important rooms like Prince Charles's billiard room and things like that, all the important things that are done in palaces, suddenly you found that the places were being opened for all kinds of concerts, that people... The people for whom Beethoven and Schubert actually wrote their music at last started to hear some of it, but it wasn't just that. It was a great pop song movement, the great pop song at the time, top of the pops for the whole of the 2 months, although I haven't actually got the charts with me at the moment to prove it, was a song called La Canaille. Now, La Canaille, my French is pretty bad, and Ian Birch will probably put me right, but I understand that La Canaille means the dregs or the scum or something of that kind, and it reminds me, the song La Canaille, which became a very popular one at that time, reminds me of the anti-Vietnam War demonstrations of 1968, when some Tory MP said in Parliament that these bloody demonstrations are being infiltrated by a lot of foreign scum. Remember that? And the first, maybe the next day, when we came out, March the 16th, 1968, for the big demonstration there, right across the Charing Cross Road, I'll never forget, an enormous banner, "We are all foreign scum." And that was the... This was the La Canaille, which was sung by Rosalie Bordas, who was the popular singer of that time, who used to sing in a short white skirt and a great red flag around her neck. In the old French city there's a race of iron men. The furnace of their fiery soul has forged to bronze their skin. Their sons are born on straw. Their palace is a slum. That's La Canaille, and I'm one of them. And that was the song. which rocked Paris all the way through that period. So there were wonderful things that were happening, tremendous things done by the Commune, even in spite of all the limitations that they had to cope with. But, and this is, the big word, it's silly to try and pretend that everything was perfect. Wasn't perfect. And things did start to go very seriously wrong. One of the reasons why it went wrong, one of them, the obvious one, the one that's mentioned by really all the people that have written about the Commune, including the best writer about the Commune, in my view, by a very long way, which is this a very old book, which you can't find because it's so very good, of course, you won't find it anywhere, by Le Sagare, translated by Eleanor Marx when she was 17. Very badly translated, by the way. But Le Sagare was in the Commune, and he makes the point over and over again that the democracy of the Commune, in spite of having all the advantages which I've mentioned already, I've talked about all the wonderful things about it, it was nevertheless, unlike the Central Committee of the National Guard, elected by geography. And because it was elected by geography, it was exceedingly difficult for the links which had made the National Committee of the Central Committee of the National Guard such a democratic organization. It was exceedingly difficult for to get the democracy flowing through the Commune in the same way. But it was elected by geography. The people who were elected were inclined to be isolated from the people that elected them. Although they were paid the same, although they were revocable at any instance, it wasn't quite obvious how they could be revocable, how you do revoke them, how do you get a meeting together to revoke somebody when you elect them by geography. When you elect them by workers' councils, or for that matter, national guards, then it's obvious to see how such a meeting can be convened. But when you do it by geography, then there's an isolation. And therefore the atmosphere in the Commune Council itself was very much one of isolation, and therefore favored all the time those sections of the Commune that fell into these categories that I've already described, as Proudhonists, people who were revolutionaries in word, but as was put in that proclamation of the Central Committee, found it very difficult to translate the words into action, that needed to get all the structures exactly right. You can detect it as I'm talking. You can probably think of people even not a million miles away from us that you can feel that you can fit into these categories, that everything had to be absolutely perfect, the structure was right, the theory had to be correct. Let's leave aside all these practical economist ideas. Let's get the theory absolutely right. Let's have a long debate on this subject and a long debate on that subject. And in that atmosphere, what Marx called in his pamphlet, and he detected it right away, mere ballers were given a bit of a field day. And the most obvious result of that was that the conduct of the war was absolutely monstrous from the point of view of the Commune. I mean, Thiers, of course, launched his counterattack. He went to Bismarck in Prussia and begged him for French prisoners so that he could enlarge his army. The army was enlarged. Thiers started from Versailles this fantastic counterattack, bombardment after bombardment, came to the very gates of Paris, and all through this time, the conduct of the war was handed over to army officers, former army officers effectively, although they, of course, supported the Commune, either handed over completely to army officers or debated at enormous length in the full meetings of the Commune. No clear understanding of these things had to be done. The people had to be appointed that you trusted, that could tap the democracy which the Commune represented, and was able to conduct a war in a properly disciplined fashion. That never occurred to people, and therefore the war went wrong really from the beginning. 2 enormous sorties with all kinds of cannon lost each other, wandered all over the place, was split and divided, was smashed to pieces by the Versailles, generals taken prisoner, cannon taken off them. Then they came up to the walls of the city. They even got into the city. The Versailles army got into the city because nobody was guarding one of the gates. The cannon at Montmartre, which had been the symbol, if you like, of the social revolution of the Paris Commune, was left untended, unguarded. No engineers went to look after it, and therefore when it was needed most, when the Versaillese were actually in the eastern parts of the city, it was unable to be used. On and on and on, mistake, 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 and error and drift, and all of this rooted really in this vague notion that revolutionaries, when they get to power, will get all the structures and the theory absolutely right, and will go on debating things even when the army is right at the enemy army is right at the door of the council chamber. But that's fairly well established, this what I've just told you. I mean, you find that in most of the Bibles, you know, of one kind or another, will tell you about that and will explain that that was one of the reasons for the failure. But there is another reason which you won't find anywhere at all, and which I really want to offer you as I think one of the principal reasons for the so early destruction of the Commune. You see, if you read Marx on the Paris Commune, he will tell you that it was elected by universal suffrage. And of course, if you read Lenin on the Paris Commune, he will tell you, because he copies it out of Marx, that it was elected by universal suffrage. Actually, yes, I mean that's a bit. I'm not sneering at Lenin. I'm not actually, because actually he just copies it out in a quotation. But come to that in a minute. The fact is that they weren't elected by universal suffrage. They weren't. And it isn't just a little mistake. Oh dear, a little bit of a slip, 9 out of 10, see me. You know, it isn't that kind of thing. It isn't, it is rather a big mistake. That is, that half the people of Paris didn't vote for the Commune. Sorry, slight error there, not quite universal suffrage, half universal suffrage. And the reason why half the people didn't vote for the Commune was because they were women. And women didn't have the vote. And no women voted for the Commune, and therefore, of course, quite obviously, there were no women members of the Commune, 92 men, some of them not particularly competent people at all. And therefore, and that's the whole machinery of the Commune, all the decision-making process which I described earlier, all of that, as well as the Commune itself, was denied to this enormous section of the Paris people, and would it go on a bit further, by far the most exploited section of the Paris people were women. The women workers not only earned less, as of course they always have done, but they had it far harder in every area of life than the male workers did. And that gap, which is completely unnoticed, I mean, you don't find it really hardly. I suppose I must have read about, 10 books upon the Paris Commune. Not even mentioned. Nobody mentions it. By the way, the women didn't vote. Sorry about that. Forgot about them. Half the population. We'll just leave them on one side. If you notice all the things that I've read up to now, the proclamation, choose men of honesty, men of decency, men of whatever it is, wonderful stuff, except you think something to yourself, well, that's very odd. What about, I don't know, women that fit into any of these categories? And apparently not, because they were completely. Now, that would be, it would be, you might expect from that the women had nothing to do with the Commune, therefore, and so, well, all right, if it's your bloody Commune, you can bloody have it, because we have nothing to do with it. You would understand that point of view, but that, of course, wasn't what happened at all. That, in fact, the action taken by the women during the period of the Commune was not only magnificent and heroic and so on, but it also appeared, in my view, to fill the gaps which were left by the way in which the male Commune absolutely worked much better, much more effectively than did the democratic process of the Commune itself. I mean, they thought there was a woman called Blanche Lefebvre that used to speak in the clubs and was one of the great heroines of this particular revolution. She said, "I love the Commune as some love a man." She fought right the way through, ended up dying on the barricades for the Commune. And that attitude, even though they had no vote in it, this simple class sense, reinforced by very little reforming legislation as far as women were concerned. I mean, it's true that the Commune recognized what was called the union libre, the union between man and woman, which wasn't based upon a marriage register, which existed very widely in the French working class at that time. I mean, they did accept that and for purposes of widows' pensions and social security payments or their like. That did have some, but that, of course, wasn't the reason why so many women fought so hard for the Commune. The feeling was a fundamental class sense that their class had taken power and their class had to be defended from the class that was at the gates. And the things that they did the organization is much more incredible, in my view, than what was done by the Commune itself, because they didn't have the machinery to do it with. The Women's Union, which was formed by a woman called Elizabeth Dmitriev, who was a friend of Marx's, a Russian actually, she formed a thing called the Women's Union on the 11th of April. That is a good time after March the 18th, and not long before May the 25th, which is the end of the Commune. And in a few days only, the Women's Union had committees in each of the 20 districts of Paris, working committees that were doing things and at the same time electing to an executive committee at the center. Now, all the sort of things that they were doing, almost all assisting the war effort. They recognized, even if the Commune didn't, that the war effort was the fundamental thing that had to be, everything had to be put into. It was then that the recruitment, for instance, the recruitment of fighters, men and women fighters, was undertaken almost entirely by the Women's Union. And they, the whole business of the distribution of food and the distribution of supplies, all these things were done, and the democracy of the Union, which was very clear, structure very, very clear, elective, revocable, all the things that had happened in the Commune, but also working body at the same time. That's what the Women's Union did. Louise Michel was not very active as far as anyone can discover, and the sources are terribly slight about all this. It's like a hen in a backyard scrabbling around for a bean, you know. You can very, very find the information that went on there, just scraps of it, which you have to put together. Louise Michel doesn't seem to be particularly active in the Women's Union. That's because she was active practically everywhere else. She was active in the Ambulance Women's Union, the Sandbags for Barricades Union, the Committee for Looking After the Wounded. All these different committees flung up on the initiative of women, which had very little to do with what the sterile debates that were going on in the Commune, or even with the sort of things that were happening in the decision making, in the machinery of the which were carrying out the decisions under the Commune. Louise Michel, you find her everywhere, and you find her more and more active as the army proceeds, the Versailles army proceeds into Paris. You find her defending with 120 women the famous women's battalion defense of the Place Blanche in the East End. 120, down to 100, down to 80, and then she's off again. And this time she's leading 50 men defending the Montmartre cemetery. I mean, they held the Place Blanche for 2 days against the most withering fire. Then they held the Montmartre cemetery for another 2 days. 50 men immediately accepted Louise Michel as the leader. Her experience, her ability in battle, she'd been out at the forts during the early parts of the war fighting there, down to 16, down to 3. And then when it was 3, she retreats again to a barricade, sees some National Guardsmen, or what she thinks are National Guardsmen approaching, shouts out, "Come and help us, there are only 3 of us," but discovers then that they aren't National Guardsmen, they're soldiers of the Thiers army, take her and fling her into the trench, leave her for the moment, and she runs away. And she runs away and comes now to her house, and she finds when she comes to her house that her mother has been taken prisoner by the secret police that came in the wake of the army. The troops set up their own secret police and intelligence to search out the leaders of the Commune, and she was being held in hostage for Louise Michel, and therefore she went and gave herself up to the nearest police station, and her mother was released, and that was how she was taken captive. Now, you come to the end of this story of the Paris Commune, and every time you come to the end of it, you don't really want to tell it. It's every time you even think of it, it's something that you want to stop thinking about and not to tell. And the reason why I'm going to tell it is because some of you, all of you, at some stage or other, have found yourself in an argument with somebody at work, or somebody at home, or a friend, or an enemy. Or maybe one or two of you have been unlucky enough to find yourself confronted by somebody like Robin Day on the television or on the radio, as I have been about 3 times in my life, and still make me wake up screaming in the night. And they all come at you with the same question all the time. Revolutionary, eh? You're revolutionary. Are you in favour of violence? Do you support violence?
And you say, and you sort of, and every time they say that, I have a sort of overwhelming urge which comes upon me, which is almost irresistible to start to talk about the Paris Commune. In the whole period of the war, from April the 2nd until May the 25th, 887 men from the Versailles army were killed. 887 in the war itself, in combat, in shooting, which that was their job. They knew they were likely to die. In the 10 days following May the 25th, from the end of the Commune, after the war was finished, when the Versailles army were in complete control of the streets of Paris, 25,000 people were taken out and shot. The order was simple: no prisoners. Anyone who in any way at all can be associated with the National Guard, with the people who have fought us for Paris, those people can be put to death. And in places like La Roquette or the barracks at Lobau, there were a continuous stream of fire, continuous, reload, and men, women and children hurled against the wall, not even made to stand up or anything, on and on and on, like a sort of endless cycle of death. The women particularly hunted out because of this horrible rumor that gripped the bourgeoisie, that there was a gang of people called pétroleurs, incendiaries, that were going out setting fire to all the stately homes of Paris, and the thing gripped imagination, and women who had any kind of receptacle at all, anything, saucepans, anything, carrying anything in the street, they were seized upon as incendiaries and shot. That's what happened there. Only just to read, just perhaps because of, I think it sums it up, the mood of the time, what Lissagaray writes about the death of Eugène Varlin, who was a hero of our movement, somebody that's very, very difficult, none of us should ever forget. Varlin, alas, was not to escape. On Sunday the 28th of May, he was recognized in the Rue Lafayette and led, or rather dragged, to the foot of the Butte Montmartre before the commanding general. The Versailles sent him to be shot in the Rue des Rosières. For an hour, Varlin was dragged through the streets of Montmartre, his hands tied behind his back under a shower of blows and insults. His young, thoughtful head, that had never harbored other thoughts than that of fraternity, slashed open by the sabres, was soon but one mass of blood, of mangled flesh, the eye protruding from the orbit. On reaching the Rue des Rosières, he no longer walked, he was carried. They set him down to shoot him. The wretches dismembered his corpse with blows of the butt ends of their muskets. The Mount of Martyrs has no more glorious one than Varlin. And what happened to Eugène Varlin happened to whole numbers of the leaders of the Commune that happened to be found in those early days after the fall. Varlin was the socialists. Varlin, the socialists, the international people, were the ones they hated most and the ones they hunted down with the utmost savagery. And what's so extraordinary about it is the enjoyment of the bourgeoisie of the violence. It wasn't just a question that they looked at it rather distasteful, had to be done, have to teach these people a lesson, they should never do it again. But the minute people set a finger upon their property, even a finger upon the prospect of their property vanishing, their rights which respond upon their property vanishing, it's not a question of teaching them a lesson or punishment or anything of that kind. It's a question of open enjoyment. Here is a man who was a bank manager, needless to say, Jacques Adouet, absolutely wonderful man, sort of man who would have loved Robin Day, had him in every night, who describes himself a bourgeois of Paris and wrote a diary of the time. He came out into the street and saw the piles of corpses in the street. His response, what sewers, what jails could have spewed forth these ferocious brutes? How an honest man delights to see these riddled with bullets, befouled and rotting. The sting of their corpses is the odor of peace. We should find it a pleasure to bathe and wash our hands in their blood. We should like to appease our hatred with the sight of torture, for we are no longer men, but savage beasts. As a matter of fact, I don't know if there's any animal experts here, but I think you'll have to go a long way before you find a savage beast which could have acted in the way in which those people acted. And the lucky ones were the ones that died. That is, the lucky communards were the ones that died. The unlucky ones were the ones that taken prisoner, like Louise Michel, that were led out out of Paris on foot, shackled together, and marched to Versailles, and the whole road lined with bourgeois. People come to see them, to spit, to shout abuse, and the man in charge of the prisoners, a particularly revolting former Tory cabinet minister called Gallifet, who was leading them, from time to time would stop and look back around to the group of people behind him and pick out people for shooting. 111 men picked out on one stop because they had grey hair and therefore had obviously fought with the revolution in 1848. Louise Michel escaped these deaths, but was not lucky to escape them. She, with hundreds of other women that had been taken prisoner, were put first of all in the prison of Satory, and then later in the women's prison at Chantières. These were not prisons, they were great barrack halls in which the women were expected to lie around. There was no sanitation of any kind. There was no way of dealing, excrement, discharge, horrible. And one of the reasons that they did it was that the people of Versailles were invited on trips into the Satory and into the Chantières prison to see how disgusting the people were who had created the Commune and wanted to equalize wealth. Look how disgusting they are, lying in their own filth here, which we have forced them to do as a result of the force of arms which we have over them. That's what happened to her there, and she waited 18 months for that, until she was finally put on trial. Many of the leading communards that went on trial groveled to the judges, gave rather a bad performance of themselves, but Louise Michel was an outstanding exception. When she was put on trial, she started off the trial by saying, no point in having this trial, no point in having it, because I absolutely accept every single charge which is made against me in relation to the Commune. Why should I defend myself? I have already announced that I refuse to do so. You are men who are going to judge me. You are before me. Your faces are revealed. You are men, and I am only a woman, yet I look you in the eye. I know very well that nothing I might say to you will change your sentence in any respect. I have been told that I am an accomplice of the Commune. Certainly, yes, for the Commune wanted above all else the social revolution, and the social revolution is the dearest of my desires. Even more, I am honored in being one of the promoters of the Commune. Then I swear by our martyrs who fell at Satory, by our martyrs whom I hail aloud here, and who one day will surely find an avenger, I am yours. Do with me what you will. Take my life if you want it. I am not the woman to argue with you for an instant. What I demand of you, who call yourselves a council of war, who sit as my judges, and do not disguise yourself at the Commission for Pardons, I must be cut off from society. You have been told to do so. Well, you are right. Since it seems that every heart that beats for freedom has no right to anything but a little slug of lead, I demand my share. If you let me live, I shall never cease to cry for vengeance, and I shall avenge my brothers by denouncing the murderers of the Commission of Pardons. That's how she replied to the judges, upon which the judge interrupts her. I cannot allow you all to speak if you go on in that manner. Louise Michel, I have finished. If you are not cowards, kill me. But of course, they were cowards. They were cowards. And they didn't kill her. They sentenced that something which is really probably worse, which was transportation for life. Now, transportation had been abolished in England, which was not, as you know, a civilized country, about 15 years prior to that. But transportation didn't exist in France for criminals at all. But transportation to the Polynesian islands, the French colonies in the Polynesian islands, was revived especially for the people of the Commune. And Louise Michel went for 9 years into a barren slab of rock called New Caledonia in the middle of the Polynesian islands. She was the only one of all the prisoners from the Commune that fraternized with the natives, made friends with the natives, even learnt the Polynesian dialect that was relevant in that place that she was living. And when the people around her tried to take some solace from the terrible discomfort in which they were living, in some kind of racial language against the natives that they were living in, she ferociously attacked them. She said that the Polynesian people were as proud and indomitable as the working people of Paris, and that, of course, was the highest possible compliment she could think of paying them. In 1880, there was 9 years after she was sent there was a an amnesty declared for all the people, as a result of pressure, of course, from the workers. There was an amnesty declared for all the people who had supported the Commune. And Louise Michel returned to Paris to an enormous demonstration at the station which went right through the city shouting about La Mère Michel, the Mother Michel, the mother of the revolution. Tremendous spirit at that demonstration. And within a year she was back again, leading another great unemployed demonstration through the streets of Paris. In fact, she diverted the demonstration into the center of the city and occupied all the big posh bakeries in the center of the city and liberated the bread and started to distribute it among the unemployed. For which, of course, she was arrested and sentenced to another 5 years in prison, which was commuted after 4 years. She refused to leave, said she wasn't receiving any favors from the state. She sat around in prison, she had to haul her out of prison, and the next week she was on a couple of demonstrations again. I was speaking at a great strike meeting in Le Havre. A fanatic shot at her, hit her in the back of in the head behind the ear, which meant that she was a year in hospital for very, very serious operation, and hardly out of that before she was campaigning and demonstrating once again at the head particularly of strike demonstrations, who were particularly the people who always called for Louise Michel to speak upon the platform there. And it was only when they threatened to put her in a mental asylum, because of course they said that she was mad. I mean, what other possible explanation can there be for a woman who just will not lie down in spite of the most fantastic oppression of every kind? She came to England. She ran a school at Fitzroy Square. In fact, I think the building, I'm not quite sure about it, but I think the building is, you'll still find the building shortly, but just behind Warren Street tube station. And she ran a little school there. She was not somebody who was a member, paid-up member of the International Socialists, which, as you know, was formed, as Tony Cliff will tell you, around and about that time. I have to make this clear. She hadn't got the line correct, you know. She was an anarchist. She wasn't an anarchist as far as I can tell during the time of the Commune. I might be wrong about that, but as far as I can tell, she did join the International and wasn't a declared anarchist by then, but by the time she came to London, she joined the anarchists and she was a member of the Autonomie Club. Her impetuosity, if you like, which had been so much in her favor, and one of her great attributes at the time of the Commune, had tumbled over into impatience, and she had, if you like, left behind what really I believe she knew instinctively, and that is that you never can have an insurrection, nor indeed any insurrectionary activity, unless it is that the class is behind you, that the masses of people are moving in that direction. I think she'd missed that. A lot of people didn't like her at all. Eleanor Marx couldn't stand her. If you read Yvonne Kapp's biography of Eleanor Marx, which is on sale in the bookshop there, the latest one, you'll see that she describes Louise Michel as heroic and slightly mad. I love that. You know, I love that from these London biographers in their comfortable studies. You know, she was slightly mad. She'd been in the Commune. She'd been in the Satori prison for 2 years. She'd been in the Chantier. She'd been in New Caledonia. She'd been in all other kinds of places. She'd been shot up in the back of the head, and she was slightly mad. Thank God. Thank God that she wasn't slightly sane like certain London biographers of former revolutionaries. At any rate, there were people who did meet her at the time and were greatly impressed about her. Sylvia Pankhurst, Barbara Winslow is going to talk about later, and I hope you'll all come and hear that, because I think that's the highlight of the weekend. But Sylvia Pankhurst met her in the house at Russell Street that her family took when she was a child, and she wrote this: Louise Michel of the Commune, the pétroleuse, as her enemies called her, a tiny old woman in a brown cloak, intensely lean, with gleaming eyes and swarthy skin, the most wrinkled you ever saw, which made me think of the twisted seams in the bark of an ancient chestnut tree. She had a beaming eye for children. I regarded her with admiration as a tremendous heroine. She seemed to belong to the magical world of imagination, not the commonplace life of every day. Sometimes I fancied her wandering in strange old forests amid the fantastic beings of fair tales. At others I saw her in the stress of battle, her slight figure leaping forward in the darkness, lit by the glare of conflagration, her bare arm uplifted with a torch, a scarlet Phrygian cap upon her raven hair, wide-mouthed with a shout of defiance, her lips drawn back with gleaming teeth, her black eyes sparkling with fierce joy. That's how she remembered her. She left, she became ill, Louise Michel. She left England. She went to Marseille. She caught a dose of pneumonia, and she was dying when they brought her the news that a revolution had broken out in Russia in 1905. And according to the reports of people that were there who brought her the news, she was exceedingly ill. But she got out of bed and she danced around the room and got back into bed again and said, "Now I'm ready to die." I wanted, as I said, to talk about the Commune at the beginning because it's so stale and horrible, the democracy which we have to go through today, that it's always good to remember that the working people that we fight for have in the past, at times like the Paris Commune, created a quite different kind of democracy, something which was quite different to it. Lenin, when he went to Finland just before the Russian Revolution in July, when he fled away from the police to Finland to plot the revolution, took two books with him. One was Clausewitz's Art of War, which he could quickly dispense with, and the other was Marx's Civil War in France, which is the book about the Paris Commune, and which is reproduced in enormous slabs all the way through it. And Lenin writes it clear, and this is where we are, and this is the lesson of the Commune, and this is the answer to the people who say that the choice is between a system between no voting at all and a system of voting every 5 years. The escape from parliamentarianism is to be found, of course, not in the abolition of representative institutions and the elective principle, but in the conversion of the representative institutions from mere talking shops into working bodies. That's the point about the Commune. Absolutely fair. I mean, against representation, we are for people choosing their government. That's what we're about. But we are for people for choosing a government that can government in their interest, and not a government that is hedged around by another secret government in all different guises, which is in fact making the decisions and carrying out the decisions that matters. But I did want to try and tell the story, which is what I've tried to do, through the life of Louise Michel, because I'm more convinced than ever that the heroines of our revolutionary tradition are even more important to us than are the heroes. That the patronizing and the insulting and the idealizing of women by in-class society shoves them down deeper into the pit of exploitation even than working men are. That's obvious. We're all accepting that. And it's precisely because they've got less to lose and more to gain, precisely that women and as working women have less to lose and more to gain, that in times of revolution you look to them for the most selfless initiatives and the best form of democratic action. That's, I think, what comes out of what little we do know about the women's action during the Paris Commune. And if we were in any doubt about it at all, what gives us the proof is that the historians which always bury our heroes deep, bury them right down deep. No chance of anyone who ever goes to school ever hearing of Moreau, Assy, Varlin, Frankel, Delacluse. These are the heroes, the male heroes of the Commune. No chance of you hearing they're buried. But what's also true is that the women that are involved in the same revolution are even deeper buried. So that it's last time I spoke last year about Toussaint Louverture, I started off by asking who in the room had heard of Toussaint Louverture, and we got a reasonable response. I didn't dare do it this year. I didn't dare. I mean, I discovered that there's even a member of the Central Committee that 2 months ago had never heard of Louise Michel. And I didn't dare to find out who it was that knew him, because the thing is so deep, so deeply buried, that even when you go to British museums and all grovelling about in all different kinds of libraries, you can't, even if you try to fight through certain parts of French books that you know about, you can't find the facts about what happened to the women in the Commune or what happened to Louise Michel. And she's been buried by history, just like hundreds of others like her, because she, above all, gave the lie to this conservative notion that is central to all conservative ideas, that women who uphold conservative values and conservative traditions all the time. She, more than anything else, doesn't matter who her lovers were, it doesn't matter about that. You don't find out, and you don't really care very much about it, because she was central in the argument about democracy and in the fight for the Commune, and even in the fights that went on in the working class after that. She was central to that all the way through. Paul Verlaine, who is the French poet, who was the press officer to the Commune, when he read the obituaries of Louise Michel, got himself into a terrific state of fury because of their stuff about how she was slightly mad and how she was a bit of a rocker, and you can't really trust women of this kind, and that's not womanhood as France knows her, and worked himself up into a terrific rage and wrote a sonnet in honor of Louise Michel, which at the very end of it explodes into fury. Heavenly name and heart, exiled by bourgeois France of supple spine. Listen, you good-for-nothing wretches, listen! Louise Michel belongs to a great and glorious line.